I'm back for part two. And so this time around, I'm going to be talking to you about early 20th century prose and introduction to modernism. So if you want to follow along with me, click on content up toward the top of our page and then course documents. And then on early 20th century prose overview, which is the document that I'm going to talk about first. So first, let me give you a little bit of an introduction to this topic and a bit of background on it. So prose, both fiction, so that's not factual, right? It's creative, and nonfiction, which is factual, of the American colonies. So back before we were a nation even, and the United States, written in the English language from about 1600 to now, captures America's quest to understand and define itself. And so we've talked about how, American literature sort of mirrors the history at every point along the way and also can be a catalyst for making history. So from the beginning, we were unique. We were diverse. We were made up of lots of different kinds of people. And over time, they arrived from all parts of the world. English obviously quickly became the language of the United States. Regional and ethnic dialects, though, have enlivened and enriched our literature almost from the start. And we've seen that with several of the pieces that we've read. So today, American prose encompasses a lot of traditions, a lot of voices that share this common context, and that is the geographical region now known to us as the U.S. Native American lit, which was largely oral, not written down, but oral at the time of colonial settlement, stands apart as a separate tradition that is really strong and varied. And I would urge you, if you ever have a chance to take a class in Native American literature, it's really, really fascinating. So, for the first 200 years, American prose reflected the settlement, the growth of the colonies, largely through histories, religious writing, and expedition and travel narratives. And biography also played an important role. So if you ever take early American literature, you'll look at all of these ideas, especially as we were searching for native heroes. So think about it. In the very beginning, when we were just colonies, sort of loosely binded, and then as we became a young nation, we didn't have any history much, and we didn't have any heroes. And all societies, all countries need native heroes, and so we were kind of struggling to find that. Fiction only began to appear after the colonies gained independence from Great Britain, when the clamor for this uniquely American kind of writing brought forth novels based on events in our past. And we didn't have much of one, but we had a little bit of one. So we had a flowering of prose in the mid-1800s. And that's when, as a young nation, we started to find our voice with literature. By then, fiction had become the dominant literary genre, the main type of literature in America. But in the 20th century, American lit took its place on the world stage and really began to exert an influence over other literatures in other parts of the world. So now we come to modernism, the 1900s. So during the 20th century, and be sure you have your centuries correct, the 1900s is the 20th century, right? And right now we're in the 21st century, the 2000s. So during the 20th century, a communications revolution that introduced film, motion picture, radio, television, brought the whole world into view and eventually right into our living rooms. Think about that. So I remember my parents, and they were 40 years old when I was born, talking about what life was like before television, and how people often sat on their front porches. This was before air conditioning too. So in the warmer months, everybody went out on their porches, and there was much more of a sense of community in neighborhoods, with your neighbors and your friends, because everyone wasn't in a room watching a screen the way we all seem to be now. But the downside of not having television was that you weren't going to be able to actually see what was happening across the world or even, in another city. So these new forms of communication began to compete with books as sources of amusement and enlightenment and knowledge. New forms of communication and new modes of transportation made American society increasingly mobile and familiar with other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So think about it, before automobiles, it took a long time to get anywhere. And so literary voices from the most remote corners could suddenly reach a national audience. And at the same time, American writers, especially fiction writers, began to influence world literature. So the 20th century, the 1900s, saw the emergence of a genre called Modernism. And Modernism, you need to know this. Modernism responded to the world's complexity because the world was increasingly getting more and more complicated, more complex, by asserting the idea that the individual, one person, one solitary person, has the potential to achieve a broader perspective than that offered by any one society or its history, right? And so remember that if I ask you to kind of define modernism, it's responding to how the world is becoming increasingly complicated. Because although life is made easier in certain ways by television and radio and film and airplanes and all of that, it's also becoming more complicated in a lot of ways as technology increases. So realism and naturalism and regionalism, local color writing, were still viable modes of expression, but they reflected the increasingly complex reality of 20th century life. Immigration and industrialization, which just kept increasing, led to increasing urbanization. So all of these people coming into our country, more and more immigrants, and more industry, more and more manufacturing, led to people needing to live in big cities. And so this is another thing that led to the growth of modernism. And we saw that kind of with realism as well. At the beginning of the 19th century, American writers struggled to convince the world that we even had a history, right? But by the 20th century, American writers, like European authors, had to grapple with more than enough history. So in the 1900s, a genre of writing began called psychological realism. And we're not really reading any of that, sadly, since we don't have a lot of time and we're covering, such a large period of time. But Henry James was a key figure in American Lit's transition from the 1800s into the 1900s. And although we're not reading him, and although more of his novels were published before 1900 than after, his style, which was characterized by this psychological rather than a physical realism, and his themes seemed a long, long way from a lot of 19th century American literature. So James used American and European subject matter and perspectives, which sort of harkens back to that idea that, one person, one individual can move beyond his or her own cultural ideas and his or her own country's ideas. And his sense of the complexities of life, both individual and cultural history, make him a modernist and a writer that the 20th century can claim as one of its literary representatives. Also, Edith Wharton was an important writer of psychological realism. Again, we're not reading her, but this is just good for you to know and remember. Her works show the influence of James, and she was another key turn-of-the-century figure. A lot of her novels take place among the wealthy and the elite of New York City, and they focus on the restrictions imposed on individuals by social definition and conventions. So, with realism, we were looking at middle-class writers. And with the psychological realists, though, on into the 1900s, like Wharton, they looked at rich people. And so, often we think the wealthy, well, gosh, they don't have any problems. If I just could win the lottery, man, I wouldn't have any problems either. But what we don't realize is that the wealthy have their own problems, which are just as difficult sometimes as that of the poor, if you think about it. Because what happens when you're wealthy, not that I am, but so I've heard, is that, a lot of people will try to befriend you simply because you're wealthy. And so you don't really know who is your true friend and who just wants something from you often. And there's a whole sort of underworld, of these wealthy people and all the social conventions that they have to adhere to. So Wharton really explored that. Now, in the 1900s, we also see social realism and naturalism. So James and Wharton were looking at the complicated psychology of the wealthy, but other writers looked to the psychological and physical reality of the laboring classes, the poorer people, whose ranks were just swelling and swelling with these high rates of immigration in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So several American writers who are sometimes known as social realists looked at working conditions in many of the factories, often for the purpose of reforming these conditions. So we see how writing actually led to changes in American life. So for example, in 1906, Upton Sinclair published a book called The Jungle, and that was a novel that exposed the unsanitary, miserable working conditions in the stockyards in Chicago, Illinois. And what's really cool about The Jungle is that the publication of that book led to an investigation by the federal government of these horrible working conditions and the subsequent passage of the Pure Food Laws. So this is a great example of how writing, literature led to actual change in American society. So as the popularity of social realism implied, the reading audience of the U.S. changed as social and economic realities were changing. So immigrant populations added a lot of variety to 20th century American fiction. We see the emergence of a lot of immigrant authors at that point in time. So you've heard of the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, right? And within that period, we had a group of writers called the Lost Generation. So this was a time of sort of a disillusionment and cynicism following World War I. Before that, there had been all this patriotism and the idea that if you were a good American and you were truly a real man and you were going to do your duty, then you would go and fight for your country. But after World War I, the First World War, there was a period of disillusionment and cynicism, and it found expression in the writings of a group of Americans living in Paris who became known as the Lost Generation. So they never formed a cohesive literary movement, but they shared a bitterness about the war. They shared a sense of rootlessness. They were very dissatisfied with American society and life, and the most influential of these include Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Thornton Wilder, McLeish, Hart Crane. And that term Lost Generation was first used by writer Gertrude Stein in her preface to Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, to characterize him and his friends in Paris. Again, you're not going to need to know this information on a quiz or anything, but it's just good information for you to understand. I will try to point out what's going to haunt you on the quizzes here. You probably know that the Great Depression occurred in the 1930s. So the glitter, the excess of the Jazz Age ended with that 1929 stock market crash, which was unprecedented and which ushered in the so-called angry decade of the 30s. And so a lot of novels of that decade echo the despair of the Great Depression. I have heard my father, who was a little boy at this time, talk about what it was like. And he talked about how in Chattanooga there were lines of people that stretched for blocks in what was called the soup line to get a bowl of soup because they were starving. It was so bad that the banks stopped foreclosing on people's houses when they couldn't pay. And the bank said, hey, we've gone under anyway, just stay in your house. We're not going to take it because it wouldn't do us any good anyway. We've gone bust, right? My father talked about hearing on the radio where wealthy people in New York City were jumping to their deaths from skyscrapers after the stock market crash because they had lost everything. So this was a horrible time. One good thing that emerged from the Depression was a federal agency first known as the Works Progress Administration and later as the Works Projects Administration, the WPA. And it was created by President Roosevelt, FDR, to put unemployed Americans to work on public projects. And one arm of the WPA was the Federal Writers Project, and it ran from 1935 to 1941. And so it employed writers to travel around and to produce travel guides, local histories, nature studies, and other works. And the FWP not only produced interesting material, it provided training ground for some incredible writers, including Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, both of whom went on to write about tensions between the races and the social classes. And it included Zora Neale Hurston, whose work we're going to be reading when we get to the Harlem Renaissance. Wright's Native Son, published in 1940, explores the extreme pressures psychologically that drive a young urban black man to violence during this time. And it established him as a leading American writer of the 40s and a key influence on younger writers like James Baldwin. If you ever get a chance to read James Baldwin's short story, Going to See the Man, it is riveting. It is really hard to read, but in terms of just the emotion that it will make you feel. But it's amazing. His first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, was awesome. It depicts Harlem in the 30s. And then Ellison's Invisible Man is often cited as one of the great American novels of the 20th century. And it's an account of a young black man who is never named in the novel, and his search for his place in the world. And it confronts this idea that American society was consciously turning a blind eye to its black members. But let me talk just one more thing I want to say quickly about the WPA. So a lot of the writers in the Federal Writers Project went into the South because at this time in the 1930s, the last of the former slaves were dying out. They were very old now and they were dying. And so one of the projects that Roosevelt had the writers do was to go in and chronicle the stories of these people before they died and before we could not hear their stories from their own lips. And there are actual recordings of these people who are telling their own stories about what it was like to be enslaved. They had very crude recording equipment, and so, it isn't like recordings today, but you can find them by doing a search online. And if you ever get a chance to do that, do it, because it is absolutely amazing. So now, the last document that I want to review very quickly with you is that Intro to Modernism. You'll find it in the same location under course documents. So what is modernism? And you're going to need to know this on some quizzes. Modernism, like postmodernism, which we'll see a little later, it's notoriously difficult to define clearly because the idea encompasses so many artistic and philosophical movements that include symbolism, futurism, surrealism, expressionism, imagism, Dada even, which we won't even go there, but it's interesting. And so to further complicate matters, a lot of modernists themselves, including some of the ones who were the best and brightest, are not affiliated with any of those groups. So it's hard to nail it down and define it, but there are some basic tenets of the modernist movement that apply in one way or another to all of the period, all of the movements, all of those writers associated. So modernist literature is characterized chiefly by a rejection of 19th century traditions and of their consensus between author and reader. So specifically, modernists were deliberately trying to break away from the conventions of the Victorian era. And we see that at every step along the way, where the realists were trying to break away from the romantics, and the naturalists were trying to break away from the realists. So this separation from 19th century literary and artistic principles is a big part of a broader goal, though, with modernism. Modernists wanted to distinguish themselves from virtually the entire history of art and literature, which is kind of impossible to do. So Ezra Pound really captured the essence of modernism with his famous dictum, "Make it new." A lot of modernist writers, though, felt that every story that could possibly be told had already, in some form or another, been told. So in order to create something new, they had to try using new forms of writing. And so this period produced a lot of experimental avant-garde styles, and that's something that you need to know for a quiz, right? So best known for that kind of experimentation in writing are people like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, whom we'll be reading, and Ezra Pound, whom we're reading. So new forms of writing. And as you can imagine, because it's really hard to write about anything new, since if you read something that was written 2,000 years ago even, a lot of the same human emotions were happening. Some modernists became kind of depressed over that. So when was modernism? The dates of the movement itself, a problematic idea, as there was in no sense a singular consolidated movement, are difficult to determine as well. But here's what you need to know for a quiz. If I ask you, when was the time period of modernism? The beginning of the 20th century is a good starting point for modernism. So 1900, the beginning of the 20th century. It saw the end of Queen Victoria's reign. It marks a symbolic break from the preceding century. And so the turn of the century also roughly coincides with the publication of several groundbreaking theories, like Freud's interpretation of dreams, Einstein's theory of special relativity. And so as such, there were real shifts, not just symbolic changes, but actual shifts in the natural sciences, the social sciences, the liberal arts that were happening at this very same time. And so, that makes 1900 a good starting point. Using the year 1900 can be a problem, though, because it excludes some writers whose texts from the late 1800s definitely display modernist tendencies. So most scholars use, 1890 as a good starting point. It's close to the end of Victoria's reign and the end of the century, but it's fairly inclusive. So again, 1890, 1900, beginning of the 20th century, if you use any of those on a quiz as the starting point for modernism, then I'm going to accept that. By convention and convenience, most scholars use 1945 as the end point for modernism, because that date marks the end of World War II, which is a big shift in world politics, as well as in the most prominent social, cultural, and literary values. So 1945, the end of modernism. So a little bit more on the modernist aesthetic. The goal of accomplishing something which, artistically speaking, had never been done before was, as I just said, often accompanied by a sense of despair due to the difficulty and sometimes impossibility of accomplishing that goal. So the despair coincides with that changing worldview that filtered through British and much of European and then American society. The pre-modernist world is characterized by this sense of order and stability that is rooted in the meaningful nature of faith and family and collective social values and a clear sense of who we are, a clear sense of identity, both personal and cultural as Americans, right? But the modernist period is characterized by a sense of chaotic instability. And you need to know this on a quiz, that's why it's emboldened. Rooted in the idea that collective social values are not meaningful to people anymore the way they were before, and leading to faithlessness, to skepticism, to this confused sense of who we are all of a sudden. And that worldview is prominent in much, though certainly not all, of modernist literature, perhaps most famously in the fragmented verse of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which you'll be happy to know I'm not going to make you read because it's awful. Don't tell my colleagues that I said that, but I'm not a fan of The Wasteland. And if you want to know why I'm not, try to read it and you'll see. Okay, so, but if anyone asks, I didn't say that. No, I did not say that at all. But I don't like The Wasteland. Okay, so thanks for your patience, and I'll see you in my next video musings.